In this video, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, we explore a truth few dare to face. Sometimes to become who you truly are, you must break who you were taught to be. There's a voice inside you waiting to be heard, buried beneath expectations, fear, and the shadows of your past. This is your call to rise, to confront what holds you back, and to reclaim the power that was always yours. The figure of the father is not simply a man, he is an idea, a myth, a symbol etched deep into the psychic structure of every human being, especially the daughter who seeks to know herself. Carl Jung describes such symbols as archetypes, universal, inherited images that live in the collective unconscious. And of these, the father archetype is among the most commanding. He represents order, law, protection, but also authority, judgment, and the weight of approval. From a young age, a child learns to associate the father with power, not necessarily physical power, but the power of should. The father's role in shaping the daughter's psyche is not just about nurture or discipline, it's about identity. She learns early on what gains approval, what is forbidden, and most dangerously, what kind of self is worthy of love. Over time, that external father becomes internalized. His voice, once spoken aloud, now lives in the corridors of her mind. Carl Jung believed that we do not become conscious by simply adding knowledge. We become conscious by confronting the symbols within us, by engaging with the mythic figures that animate our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And the father is one of those figures. In the psychological sense, he becomes a living force in her unconscious. He is no longer her actual father, but a powerful inner figure made up of societal norms, generational conditioning, and unexamined beliefs. For many women, especially in patriarchal systems, the father archetype evolves into a dominating inner critic. He does not just protect, he commands. He does not just support, he defines. She begins to censor herself before speaking, doubting herself before acting, hesitating before dreaming, not because someone is stopping her, but because the voice within his voice has become law. This is what Jung called the father complex, a psychological structure where the inner father has become inflated, distorted, or unchallenged. It's important to understand that this does not always reflect the nature of her actual father. A man can be gentle and loving, but if the society around her teaches her to seek male validation, to be pleasing, to be controlled in her ambition, then the father archetype takes that form. He becomes the lawmaker of her inner world. And so her personality forms around this unseen figure. She learns to be the good daughter, the obedient soul, the acceptable version of herself. But this inner structure, while it once provided safety and order, eventually becomes a prison. Jung observed that every archetype has both a light and shadow side. The father archetype gives us structure, but it can also trap us in rigidity. It offers guidance, but it can silence intuition. And so the very figure that once gave her a sense of belonging now limits her from becoming whole. She begins to feel a dissonance, a tension between who she is and who she was told to be. This is the moment of awakening, the moment when a woman begins to realize that her thoughts are not always her own, that her fear of disappointing others, of being too much or not enough, is rooted in something older, deeper, more archetypal. This is when she must begin the psychological work Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, by integrating the unconscious into consciousness. Individuation requires confrontation, not with other people, but with the inner figures who have shaped, and none are more powerful than the father. He must be seen, not as a villain, but as a myth, a symbol that has guided, limited, and now must be transformed. In Jungian therapy, this process often involves dream analysis, active imagination, and symbolic exploration. The father may appear in dreams as a king, a priest, a judge, or even a wall, a voice, a command. He appears however the unconscious chooses to portray the dominant structure in the psyche. The task is not to banish him in anger, but to question him, to ask, whose approval am I still chasing? Whose voice stops me from speaking? Whose standards am I measuring myself against? And when the answers come, not just intellectually, but emotionally, she begins to see that the father lives within, not as a person, but as a set of ideas, rules, fears, expectations. And only by naming them, by bringing them into the light, can she begin to loosen their grip. This psychological death of the father is essential, not because the father is evil, but because he has become too powerful within. The inner world must have balance. The woman cannot become herself while living under his gaze. She cannot find her own rhythm while dancing to his silent song. And so she begins to rebuild the self, not around obedience, but around authenticity. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but no one becomes themselves without confronting what they are not." The father as archetype must be broken, not destroyed, but reframed. He must return to his rightful place, a guide, not a god. Only then can the woman step into her wholeness, not as a reflection of him, but as her own source of truth. This is not a betrayal, it is a birth, and it begins by seeing the father not as a man, but as a myth, who has lived long enough in her mind. Carl Jung taught that the human psyche does not develop through external success or obedience to social roles. It evolves through inner confrontation, through moments of tension, where the unconscious rises to meet the conscious mind and demands transformation. For women, the journey of self-realization, what Jung called individuation, is often shaped by the inherited presence of the father archetype. This archetype can become so deeply embedded in the psyche that her sense of identity forms around it, long before she becomes aware of its power. At first, this identification appears helpful. The father offers structure, authority, guidance. He represents logic, discipline, and external validation. A young girl raised to please, to behave, to excel, may do so not from inner conviction, but from the deep unconscious desire to fulfill the expectations of the inner father. She learns to model herself according to standards that are often rooted in patriarchy, not because anyone forces her to, but because the voice of the father lives inside her, whispering rules about what makes a worthy woman. This is where the true psychological conflict begins, because the process of feminine individuation requires her to question those very standards, to challenge the unconscious patterns that once earned her love and safety. And that is no small task. Jung reminded us that individuation always involves a death of some kind, a symbolic dismemberment of who we believed we were. For a woman raised under the influence of the father complex, this means she must dismantle the inner structure that was built to please him. But how does this manifest? Often it shows up in quiet self-abandonment. A woman may silence her intuition in the name of logic. She may dismiss her creative impulses for fear they're too chaotic, too emotional, too irrational, echoes of a deeply internalized belief that feminine energy is unruly and must be controlled. These are not conscious choices, they are inherited psychological patterns, absorbed over years through family, culture, education, and religion, all vehicles of the father's voice. She may begin to feel a split within herself, one part that conforms, performs, and maintains the image of the good daughter, and another part, buried deeper, that yearns to break free. This buried part often appears first as anxiety, depression, or rebellion. Jung called this the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything the ego has repressed or rejected. And the shadow is not evil, it is misunderstood power. The woman's anger, her ambition, her sensuality, her intuitive knowing, all may be locked away in this shadow, because they did not align with the father's rules. It is at this point that she may begin to experience symptoms of inner suffocation. She may feel deeply unfulfilled, despite appearing successful. She may feel trapped in roles she once desired, and she may hear a whisper from deep within, "This isn't me." That whisper is the beginning of individuation. It is the soul's way of inviting her inward, toward what Jung described as the self, the true center of the psyche, far beyond the ego or persona. But the journey toward the self demands confrontation with the father's shadow. It demands that she look directly at the beliefs she inherited and ask, do these still serve me? Are these truly mine? This is not a comfortable process. It is often accompanied by guilt, fear, and a deep sense of betrayal, not necessarily of others, but of the identity she has built. Yet Jung insisted that the path to wholeness cannot be walked without first shedding the false self. The father complex, in this sense, becomes the internal structure she must deconstruct. It is the mental architecture of external approval, the invisible scaffolding that holds her in place, even as she tries to grow, and she cannot grow fully until she breaks it down. This may mean disappointing people, stepping out of expected roles, speaking truths that others are unwilling to hear. But it is through this rupture that the real transformation begins. Jung viewed individuation as a sacred task, one that aligns the individual with their innermost truth. For women, this often means reclaiming parts of themselves that the father archetype suppressed. The emotional self, the irrational, the sensual, the wild. These are not weaknesses, they are essential elements of wholeness. The goal is not to reject the father entirely, but to bring him into balance with the other forces within the psyche. He must become a respected part of her inner world, not its ruler. And so the process continues. She begins to listen to her intuition again. She speaks with her true voice, not the filtered one shaped by fear. She makes decisions not from duty, but from deep alignment. In Jungian terms, this is integration, the conscious acceptance of what was once unconscious. The father no longer controls her from within. He becomes part of her, but not all of her, and she at last becomes a self-contained source of power. Jung reminded us that individuation is not about becoming perfect, but becoming whole, and to be whole, a woman must walk through the fire of her own becoming. She must separate from the voices that once defined her, and step fully into her own authority. Only then can she say, not with rebellion, but with rooted certainty, I am not who he told me to be. I am who I was meant to become. Carl Jung believed that at the core of every psychological transformation lies a symbolic death, a letting go of an old structure of identity so that a new and more authentic self may emerge. When we speak of killing the father in a Jungian sense, we are not referring to a literal act or even an act of personal rebellion. Rather, we speak of a necessary inner transformation, a confrontation with the internalized authority figure that has unconsciously shaped our identity. The feminine soul, in her journey toward wholeness, must symbolically break the father figure, not out of hatred or defiance, but because her true self cannot be born while his voice remains unchallenged at the center of her psyche. This is the task of psychological separation. In developmental terms, we often speak about individuation as a separation from the collective, from social norms, from parental ideals. But Jung went deeper. He showed us that this separation is not just behavioral, it is symbolic and archetypal. For many women, especially those raised within patriarchal frameworks, the inner father becomes a fixed psychic image that speaks with the tone of law, moral rightness, and conditional love. She hears this voice in her choices, her fears, and her self-doubt. It says you must, you should not. This is how to be worthy. These are not just rules, they are psychic imprints. The archetypal father serves a critical role in the psyche. He brings order to chaos. He builds civilization from instinct. He protects the child from the unknown. But when his image becomes too dominant, when it overshadows the feminine qualities of receptivity, intuition, and wild self-expression, he becomes a tyrant within. And that tyranny is subtle. It does not scream, it whispers. It disguises itself as discipline, as logic, as moral superiority. A woman may live half her life under this internal regime, mistaking it for her own voice, until a crack begins to form, often in the form of crisis, anxiety, or a quiet, aching dissatisfaction. This is where the death of the father becomes inevitable. The self can only endure so long in a divided state, torn between the persona she built for approval and the deeper, unspoken truth of who she is. When that inner pressure builds, it often erupts in shadow form. Perhaps she begins to rebel, to say no more often, to question her relationships, her work, her religion. She may even be accused of being lost, unstable, ungrateful. But what is really happening is that her inner world is reorganized. The unconscious has risen to the surface and is demanding a new structure, one that is not built around submission to inherited ideals, but alignment with her inner truth. Jung described this as the confrontation between the ego and the self. The ego is the constructed identity, shaped by childhood, society, and early survival patterns. The self is the totality of the psyche, including the shadow, the anima, the archetypes, and the unconscious will. To move toward the self, the ego must relinquish control. And in the case of a woman ruled by the father archetype, this means that she must consciously dismantle the inner structure that was once sacred. She must deconstruct the mental and emotional habits built to earn approval from an inner voice that no longer serves. This symbolic death is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is slow, quiet, woven into daily decisions. She chooses differently, speaks up when she used to stay silent, walks away from roles that once felt like duty, and in doing so she steps into the terrifying and liberating space of self-authorship. No longer ruled by the need to be good in his eyes, she begins to ask, what is good for me? That question, though simple, is revolutionary for someone who has lived under the weight of unconscious authority. the inner world begins to shift. Where once there was fear, there is now curiosity. Where once there was perfectionism, there is a tolerance for, and where once there was obedience, there is choice. The father as inner figure does not vanish, he transforms. He becomes symbolic again, not a voice of domination, but one of structure, purpose, and clarity. The difference is that now he is balanced. His voice does not override her own. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of integration. The goal is never to destroy any part of the psyche, but to bring all parts into right relationship. The father has a place, he is needed, but he must no longer sit on the throne of the woman's identity. She is no longer the daughter seeking his blessing. She becomes the sovereign soul, the one who blesses herself. The killing of the father, then, is not an end. It is an alchemical process, a dismembering of the false in order to reveal the. It is the symbolic fire that burns away the lies she was given about what it means to be enough, to be lovable, to be whole. And when the flames subside, what remains is not emptiness, but the beginning of her truest become. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For the woman seeking psychological freedom, there comes a moment when she begins to realize that her life has not been entirely her own, not because of outer circumstances alone, but because of the inner structures that have shaped her choices, without her awareness. At the center of these structures, often stands the image of the father, not merely the literal father, but the symbolic one, the archetypal lawgiver, the internal judge, the measure by which she has unconsciously evaluated her work. As she enters the terrain of inner work, whether through dreams, therapy, solitude or suffering, she may begin to see that her values have been borrowed, her desires filtered, her voice softened, not because she lacks strength, but because she has learned to survive through adaptation. The father's voice, inherited and internalized, becomes the compass that always points outward, toward approval, achievement, structure, and restraint. It often sounds like duty, like logic, like morality, and for a time it offers the illusion of safety. But deep within, another voice calls. It is less articulate, less defined. It lives in the body, in the dreams, in the emotions she suppresses. It does not speak in commandments, it moves in waves, impulses, symbols. This is the voice of the self, the part of her that was never shaped by anyone else. And as this voice becomes louder, tension arises. She feels the quiet rebellion within her spirit, the refusal to conform to roles that no longer fit, the yearning to create rather than perform, the ache to live from a deeper source. This is where the reconstruction of identity begins. The false self, the one shaped in the father's image, starts to fall apart. What once felt like success, now feels hollow. What once felt like obedience, now feels like betrayal of the soul. Jung described this collapse not as failure, but as initiation. The persona, the mask we wear for the world, must crack to allow the deeper self to emerge. And for women, that mask is often crafted in the shadow of the father, the good girl, the achiever, the pleaser, the caretaker, the rational adult, who never asks for too much. To retrieve the authentic self, she must begin to grieve, not only for the lost years, but for the parts of herself she buried to be loved. Grief becomes sacred in this process. It is not weakness, it is a form of truth-telling. Through it, she begins to reclaim what was once exiled, her instinct, her anger, her joy, her chaos. These are not problems to fix, they are fragments of a self that was never fully allowed to live. This process often brings fear. Without the father's voice, who is she? If she is no longer living for approval or structure, what guides her? These questions are not answered overnight. They must be lived, wrestled with, and honored. Jung emphasized the importance of holding the tension between opposites. The ego wants clarity, but the soul grows through uncertainty. In the space between the broken identity and the emerging self, she must learn to stay, to remain present in the mystery, to trust what is unfolding even when it has no name. In this liminal space, something profound happens. She begins to hear herself again, not the voice shaped by fear or conditioning, but the one that speaks in images, sensations, intuition. Her dreams become more vivid, her body becomes more expressive, her creativity stirs. These are not accidents, they are signs of life returning to the inner world. The symbolic killing of the father has made room for something new, not rebellion, for rebellion's sake, but creation that arises from her deepest truth. As her identity reconstructs, it no longer needs to be defined in opposition to anyone, not even the father. She no longer lives as a reaction to the past. She begins to live from presence, from inner alignment. The father in this new inner landscape is no longer a dominating figure. He becomes a part of the whole, a voice she may choose to listen to, but not obey blindly. Structure becomes flexible. Authority becomes internal. She no longer seeks permission to be herself. This stage of the journey is marked by increasing integration. Jung believed the true self includes both the masculine and the feminine, both order and chaos, both light and shadow. The woman who has confronted and transformed the father within her no longer rejects what she once feared. She holds complexity without being overwhelmed by it. She is no longer torn between pleasing others and abandoning herself. Her center is now within. Her voice belongs to her. What emerges is not just a new identity, but a new way of being, not as a reflection of someone else's vision, but as a sovereign soul who carries her own light. The father's spell has been broken, not out of bitterness, but through the sacred work of returning to herself. And in doing so, she becomes the author of her own myth, not a daughter of commandment, but a woman of presence, rooted in a self no longer defined by anyone else's gaze. The journey to selfhood is never simple, nor is it easy. To break free from the inner father archetype is to confront the shadows we have inherited, those invisible chains, woven from voices, not our own. But through this confrontation, through the symbolic death and transformation of the father within, the true self begins to emerge. It is a rebirth, not of rejection, but of integration, a sacred balancing of all parts of the psyche. In embracing this difficult work, a woman moves beyond limitation and steps fully into her own sovereignty, becoming whole and free at last. This is the power of individuation, the unfolding of the soul, and the ultimate path to freedom.